Hello, so today we're going to continue to talk about water pollution, and in particular, we're going to talk about some pollution issues in marine environments or some global issues. So far, we've really been focusing on our impacts on our watershed around us and really looking at how our actions are causing some of these pollution problems nearby in the freshwater, either the surface water or the groundwater. But what we need to start doing now is thinking a little bit bigger. So I want you to keep in mind that all that fresh water is going to drain into first an estuary and then out into the marine environments of the oceans. And a lot of these areas are subject to the same problems as freshwater. So all the things that we've talked about so far, it doesn't just go for freshwater. Those point source and non-point source pollution problems are still going to be an issue in marine systems. You're still going to have a lot of problems with eutrophication. So remember, that can come from excess nutrients from all kinds of different things, fertilizers, sewage, things like that, animal waste, and that will cause an algae bloom and a dead zone. And that is going to happen in your marine systems. In fact, the Gulf of Mexico has a huge dead zone every year for that same reason. Biomagnification is still going to continue to occur, and we'll talk more about some of those really toxic compounds next time, the particular ones that you need to know. Thermal pollution, changing the water temperature, is still an issue. Solid waste we'll talk about more today, and then next time we'll also get into some of those radioactive substances and other hazardous wastes. So all of these things overlap between freshwater and marine systems, but there are some things that are more challenging to a marine system usually than a freshwater one, or that we can consider to be more of a global problem. So these are the things that we're going to focus on today. And the last thing on there, over-harvesting fish and other seafood, that really isn't a pollution issue, but this is a good time to talk about some of our problems in the marine environments in general. So the first one we're going to talk about is dredging. And basically dredging is any time you remove sediment from the bottom of a river or pond or anything like that. So a lot of times dredgers are used behind dams to get rid of some of the extra sediment that builds up. Or they'll be used if you're building a bridge or a tunnel, or if a shipping channel is just getting too filled up with sediment and the ships can't get through anymore, they'll take some of that dirt out. And that'll help to be able to still use it as a deep channel like it used to be. There are a bunch of negative effects of dredging, however. Whenever you're taking sediments out, those benthic organisms that live down there, you're disturbing their habitat, and you might even wind up taking some of those benthic organisms up with the sediment. So you're removing organisms, and that of course is going to hurt biodiversity. In addition, when you do this, you create this dust plume, and that starts on the bottom. You're stirring up all the bottom sediments here, but then you also get dust plumes that kind of go through the whole water column, and in some cases they're actually kind of spitting the sediments out onto a beachy area, and in that case you have them getting up into the air as well, and then of course they could settle on the surface of the water again. And this dust plume has a lot of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in it from all the decaying things that are sitting on the bottom here. It also is where a lot of those bioaccumulating toxins can kind of hang out, things like lead and mercury and things like that. So that all gets released back into the water, and that can cause some major problems that we've already talked about, but that can also just kind of smother everything at the bottom, which is called blanketing. Another issue with dredgers is the amount of noise that they create. And you don't usually think of sound as pollution, but sounds can really scare away organisms. A lot of organisms rely on echolocation, so fish actually have something called a lateral line that allows them to sense everything that's happening in the water around them, and that depends a lot on waves, sound waves, and that sort of thing. So if you introduce a lot of extra sounds, that will interfere with that system. A lot of species also communicate by sound. Whales is probably the example you know of the best, so that's going to interfere with their communication between other members of the species. And then there's some other impacts of dredging here. It's going to really change all of the zonation in that marine environment so that now you have a different water level than what you started with. So that's going to alter the distribution of these different types of habitat in that intertidal zone or subtidal zone. And it might even change how much the tides actually rise and fall when you're removing huge amounts of sediment. So there's lots of different things that can be affected by dredging. Another issue that we need to talk about is ocean dumping. So it's any time, basically any substance you can think of, it gets dumped out at sea, and this happens quite a bit. So barges and ships are completely legally, this is not against the law, they're routinely dumping quantities of different things like the dredged sediments, trash, sludge from sewage treatment at all kinds of different sites around the world. And a lot of times these things have some toxic contaminants in them, heavy metals, things like that. And really the number one problem that we see is things like plastics and rubber that just don't biodegrade that are getting dumped. And if we look at some of the statistics, one thing I forgot to mention, things like old weapons, munitions also being dumped. So if we look at some of the statistics, you can see that 80% of the trash that is dumped in the ocean is actually from land, but then 20% is coming from those ocean activities. So a lot of it is things like nets from fishing, or cruise ships that are dumping wastewater and things like that. And all of these things can cause a lot of problems. Obviously, trash causes its own problem, but if you have extra nutrients from things like sewage, you're going to get those dead zones and things again. So if we look at what actually washes up on the beach, that can tell us a lot about what's being dumped in the ocean or what's making its way there one way or the other. And you can see that plastics are really the biggest group. And they're followed by a lot of these other things that don't biodegrade very easily, like metal or glass. And then you have less and less of the things that tend to break down a little bit easier. So this is a major problem, and it's a worldwide problem because the oceans don't really belong to any one country. So there was a London Dumping Convention in 1972 where everybody tried to get together and agree that we shouldn't be dumping highly toxic pollutants, radioactive waste, or anything very dangerous into the open sea. And on this map, you can see that not everybody was involved in this. So the yellow ones are the countries that attended but did not really agree to follow the protocol. The green ones are the ones that did agree to follow all of the guidelines. The red was not even involved in the first place. Couple things to note though, Great Britain, Russia, China, and Belgium all kind of wrote into this that they can legally exempt themselves. So if they decide to, they can go ahead and dump some of these toxic pollutants out into the oceans, even though they agreed not to. I want you to also notice that the US never actually agreed not to either. And you see that happening in a lot of our policies sometimes, where even though we kind of want to take the lead, we don't necessarily sign up. All right, so if we look at marine debris and where it's coming from, as we said, most of it is coming from land. And if you look at that, most of it's actually coming from recreational activities right along the shore. So things like people going to the beach and leaving their trash behind. A huge amount, 25%, comes from smokers, leaving cigarette butts most of the time, but things like lighters and things like that also. And then there is a smaller percent that is also coming from those water activities as well. And a lot of this debris that's being left on the beaches or that's getting into the water one way or another, the problem is it doesn't break down very easily. And you can kind of see some of the timelines here for how long it would take for these things to break down completely in the environment and be recycled back into the environment. And it's really pretty staggering. These all take a very long time, especially when you're talking about plastics. And since they're going to take so long, it's usually beyond the lifetime of an organism. So a lot of organisms can actually become caught in this debris, and then that can cause them to at least have very severe defects if they literally have to grow around it, or in many cases it can kill them off completely. One of the biggest issues with ocean dumping is that our currents kind of collect it all in certain areas. So there's something known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So you'll remember from our second unit that high pressure areas exist around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and these air currents in these areas cause these gyres, which are those surface currents in the ocean. And these surface currents kind of pick up all the trash from the coastlines of these different continents, and they kind of swing it all towards the middle. So this Great Pacific Garbage Patch is up here, and it's considered the largest landfill in the world, even though it's technically not on land. There's millions of pounds of trash there, and it kind of collects and then circulates back around to the different continents, and you'll get all sorts of trash washing up on the beaches from this. One of the biggest issues with this is something called plastic sand, which is tiny little particles of plastic that won't break down. And sometimes it literally looks like sand, it's that small. And organisms can eat this, and this can build up in their body. A lot of those plastic compounds are not something that you really want a lot of in your body. So the eastern part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is actually twice the size of Texas, and it's out in the middle of the Pacific, kind of in between Hawaii and California in terms of a north-south location. And then the western patch is sort of in between Japan and Hawaii. And both of these patches are connected by this subtropical convergence zone, which is where a lot of the currents are coming through. So there's trash all throughout this area. And one of the problems with these plastic particles that these organisms are ingesting is the phytoplankton can actually take up those tiny little pieces of plastic, and then the zooplankton eat them and they get the plastic, and then the small fish eat them and they get the plastic, and the bigger fish, and it sort of biomagnifies. Even though it technically does not break down to the size of a molecule, it can build up in a lot of these organisms' bodies, and the chemicals in the plastic can build up as well. So if we really start looking at the gyres here, we can see that the trash can take a long time to travel in this gyre. It can take anywhere from 6 months to 6 years to move around the gyre and possibly back to the beaches again. There are garbage patches out in the Atlantic Ocean too, but they don't seem to have the same severity as the Pacific one. So if you start to look at some of the things that are contained in here, you see again and again plastics, 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 and all sorts of containers and packaging. And even things like face wash, things that you probably don't think about having plastic in them, they have plastic in them that can contribute to this. So I'm not talking about the container itself, I'm talking about little exfoliants. Most exfoliating products actually now contain plastic beads, and these little beads can get into the groundwater and add to that plastic sand eventually back out into the oceans. So if you're going to use an exfoliating product, you always want to try to find something with a natural exfoliant like an apricot shell or cocoa bean, because that's going to break down. These plastic beads will not, and then they'll wind up in the ocean and they'll contribute to this whole problem. So when you actually go out and see this garbage patch, you won't always look down into the water and see garbage, because a lot of those sands are so broken up, it'll look kind of murky. It might be multicolored, it might not, but it does go down about 10 meters deep, and you have this collection of trash there. And it's not degrading, it's just kind of staying there for a very, very long time and being recirculated. So in order to avoid this, there are a whole bunch of things we can do. The most obvious is make sure that you deal with your trash properly. It goes in a recycling bin preferably, or if it has to, it goes into a trash can and into a landfill. But also things like if you're fishing, make sure that you don't leave any fishing line behind. Clean up any sort of spills that you have when boating, especially if it happens to be something like a fuel spill. Recycling motor oil, making sure that that doesn't ever go down the drain or into a storm drain. That's really important. Trying to use reusable items so that you don't make as much trash in the first place, and properly disposing of any sort of hazardous material, especially things like batteries, is very important, and keeping a lot of this trash out of our waterways. Right, so let's talk about another global problem, oil spills. And this is probably one that most of you are pretty familiar with. So its cause is kind of obvious. Oils getting into the water. This can happen because a tanker has been damaged and is leaking water out of a ship, leaking oil, or the drilling site itself can be the one with the leak, or in some cases you might actually have an oil pipeline on land that's leaking and it's getting into the water that way. So there's lots of different ways this can negatively impact species. It can get into the wetlands, and that's going to significantly damage the system. It's not going to be able to filter things out as well. It can also kill off a lot of those organisms there. Any of those benthic organisms that live on the shoreline there are going to be kind of suffocated by that oil. Anything in that photic zone, which remember is anything that light penetrates, so a lot of those SAV, a lot of those plants growing along the shore are going to be prevented from getting sunlight for photosynthesis. A lot of the top predators are going to be affected by either their food sources being affected or themselves being physically covered in oil. So that's one of the biggest problems, is that it actually coats the organisms and then they can't float, they can't stay insulated, and of course it can poison them as well. So some of the worst oil spills, if we take a look, you've probably heard of a couple, like the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon. That was the BP spill. But I want you to kind of notice that in comparison to some of the other ones, that those are actually fairly small. So there are some that we've never heard of, probably because they're not local, but they have pretty massive spills. So two that you should know, the Exxon Valdez happened in March 24th of 1989 off the coast of Prince William Sound in Alaska, and it had an immense effect on wildlife, killed off a lot of different organisms in that area. You can see this is kind of how it spread. So it started up in here, and then you can see how far the oil spread down, and in some cases it took several months to reach all the way down here. The other problem with this spill, since it happened in Alaska, you couldn't really get in to clean it up very easily because there are no roads going to this area. So they had to bring all the cleanup efforts in through helicopter or through boat. And a couple of different things they tried to clean it up. They sprayed a dispersant, which is a chemical that helps to break up oil, and then once it's dispersed, once it's broken up, it's not generally as toxic because it gets spread out. But there wasn't really enough wave action to carry that dispersant very far, so that didn't really work. They tried burning it because it's less dense than water. It will float on top. You can burn it off, but they had some bad weather that prevented them from being successful at this. Then they tried some mechanical equipment using booms and skimmers that kind of float on the surface of the water and try to buoy in all of the oil, and those kept getting clogged. You can actually hand wash wildlife with dish soap, and that is a method that gets used in most oil spill cases. But that's very expensive and time consuming. What they really wound up using most of, what was really successful, was using these high pressure hot water systems. Now, of course, if you are spraying very hot, very highly pressurized water at different organisms, a lot of them probably are not going to survive. So in many cases, that was what happened, especially those microbial ecosystems, those little bacteria and decomposers that a lot of the ecosystem is depending on, wound up dying off because of the hot water. If you look at some of the cleanup costs, you see that in some cases it gets very exorbitant. And sometimes you do have to start to wonder, okay, when does the cost kind of outweigh the benefit? So it's something that should be considered. Another one you should know about is in San Francisco, is the Costco Busan oil spill 2007. In San Francisco Bay, there were 53,000 US gallons of heavy fuel oil that leaked out of this container ship called the Costco Busan. And this container ship ran into the tower of the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge in the fog, and then that spilled oil everywhere from that. So the oil spill that you're probably most familiar with is the BP oil spill, or in other words, it's actually called the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And this was on April 20th of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. And this BP-owned oil rig essentially exploded and sank to the floor, and we had this oil gusher that was flowing for 87 days until it was finally capped on July 15th. And the US government estimated that the total discharge in these 87 days was 4.9 million barrels, which is estimated to be the largest oil spill that was ever accidental. So a lot of those ones I saw you before, those were sort of acts of war that people purposely spilled oil. This case, this was not the case here. So after several different efforts to contain the flow, they finally actually truly got it sealed on the 19th of September because they had some leaking between then. And there are some reports that it actually may still be continuing to leak a little bit. This is very significant impact, and most of you have seen this in the news. They're really spread all over the Gulf of Mexico. Huge cleanup efforts. So again, here are these booms and skimmers where they're seeking to contain some of that oil, bring it up onto the shore so that they can skim it off of these shallow waters, or they can otherwise remove it. Huge cost to wildlife, lots of different organisms that are affected by this, and huge costs to industry as well, especially obviously the fishing industries, but any beaches, any recreational industries also suffered from this. So these are some of the techniques that they used to clean up the BP oil spill, and it included everything from literally wiping down the marsh grasses to burning the smaller oil slicks, blocking them with booms, using dispersants that were sprayed from airplanes in order to break them up, skimming the oil off the surface, literally with vacuums sometimes, and then having people walking along the beaches and raking up contaminated sand and things like that. So the impact of all these oil spills on our legislation is that it's really made us put more strict safety standards into place. So it's required that all tankers have a tugboat escort to try to get them in and out of harbors safely. They have to have a double hull so that there's one more wall to break through before you can get to the oil. They have to provide funding to clean up for themselves if they should get into some sort of incident. So that's part of what was provided for by the Ocean Pollution Act of 1990. You can't ship oil into the U.S. unless you have a plan to prevent spills and also a containment and cleanup plan in case it does cause a spill. And part of the reason for this is that it can take at least 30 years for the ecosystem to recover from an oil spill, even a minor one. Now, one option that is looking kind of promising is bioremediation, where they're actually thinking about taking things like algae and different microbes in that will break apart the oil at a molecular level and turn it back into non-toxic compounds that can be released into the environment. So that's a promising future treatment. All right, we're going to go through some effects that we've already talked about really quickly. So another global effect is coral bleaching. Remember that that's coming from those increased ocean temperatures, which is usually the effect of air pollution, and that air pollution also creates ocean acidification as well. So all of these other things can also contribute to coral bleaching, but again, we talked about more of that when we were addressing climate change earlier in the year. Acid rain, remember, is also a global issue, and this we've also talked about already, where these compounds will combine with water and form these acids, and then that comes down as rain, and that can harm the organisms. We need to talk about, and again, this is not really a pollution issue, but we should talk about some unsustainable fishing practices. So part of the reason why fishing is such an issue is it's a global commons. So that tragedy of the commons plays out very often, because who really has the right to the ocean? Who has the right to fish? Everybody sort of thinks they have equal rights there. So since not any one nation owns it, we have to share this resource, and a lot of times that leads to it being misused. Many nations have actually extended their jurisdiction to 200 miles offshore, and this removed most fisheries from international use because 90% of global fisheries are actually harvested in very shallow waters. But it still doesn't help if the countries don't set limits on how much fish can be taken and they don't manage their population of fish. So those most popular species usually get over harvested, and those are usually the large predatory species that keep the whole ecosystem in check, like tuna, marlin, swordfish, salmon, things like that. So right now we have at least 28% of the world's fish stocks currently being depleted for a couple reasons. We need more protein to feed our growing population, and we've gotten to the point where we can catch almost every fish in a certain area using advanced fishing strategies. So this is an example of some of the different fishing strategies that they can employ. So modern fishing equipment uses things like sonar, radar, computers, airplanes, satellites, and they're very good at finding fish, and they're very good at catching them. And that means that fewer and fewer are left behind to reproduce, especially if it's a fishery that is not well managed by some sort of government agency. Couple of these fishing practices that are particularly harmful is dredging. In this case, we're not dredging for sediment, but they're actually using a dredger to pick up things like scallops and clams, and they drag it along the ocean floor, and that, of course, is doing all of the things that another type of dredging would do. It's stirring up those sediments, it's destroying those benthic environments. Another type that's pretty harmful is trawling, and these trawl nets will also drag along the bottom of the ocean, and then this net kind of comes out from behind them, and they can catch so many things in these nets. So it's not always what they're looking for. They're also going to have some other things in there. And when fishermen catch things that are not what they intended to catch, that is called bycatch. So it's estimated that up to a quarter of what fishermen actually catch was accidental. There are other organisms that they didn't want to get in there. They don't have a high commercial value, so they get dumped back into the ocean. And most of those organisms that got caught by accident wind up dying, either because they were crushed by the fishing gear or they were just out of the water too long. The fishermen are usually really only interested in those high commercial value fish like menhaden, salmon, tuna, flounder, those kind of things. And there are lots of different organisms, sea turtles, dolphins, different types of fish that they don't want, even birds that can get caught up in this. So one of the things that you can do to make sure that you're supporting sustainable harvesting of fish and seafood is you can try to make educated choices. And Monterey Bay Aquarium has a really great system. They have an app and a little pocket guide that you can carry with you. This is their website there. And it tells you, okay, these are the ones that are most sustainably harvested. These are not bad either. You want to try to avoid these ones because these are not harvested sustainably in most places in the world. Another issue with fisheries is aquaculture. So aquaculture is fish farming, and it can actually work very well, and you can produce a lot more food this way. So this is one way we're looking at to feed a growing human population, is having more aquaculture. In the case of something like an oyster, aquaculture could even improve water quality because oysters filter out seawater naturally. So they can filter out nutrients and things like that. But when aquaculture is not done properly, you get a lot of negative effects too. So especially when you're talking about what we call an open pen sea cage aquaculture, which is something looks kind of like this, there are a lot of pros and cons. So it has to be done sustainably. So some of the problems are, for instance, with shrimp, a lot of developing countries that are growing them by aquaculture cut down the coastal mangrove forests that are so important to the environment. In a lot of cases, because you have so many fish concentrated in a small area, you have a massive amount of waste being produced by that fish. You have parasites, you have problems with antibiotics and different chemicals that you're feeding to those fish being released into the environment. You have the fish themselves getting out and escaping, or in in some cases even becoming invasive species, or those genetically modified organisms getting out and breeding with the native populations. Um, in some cases you have larger areas of die-off where a lot of them are dying at once, and then that can become a problem. Um, so all of these things have to be considered with aquaculture, and there has to be some sort of plan for how you're going to deal with them. And if you can do that, then there are a lot of positive impacts for this, and this can be a very sustainable method of food production. All right, so next time we're going to talk more about some of these specific chemicals that are causing water pollution, and that should wrap up our water unit. Thank you for your patience. Have a good night.